So today the team will be presenting their research on the question of to what extent will AI advancements in China affect the risk of a militarized interstate dispute between the US and China. So they will be exploring how competition is mounting in the development of AI technology and its likely effects on global stability. So without further ado, I would like to invite Kiara and James on to present their findings and research with us.
Thanks, Ishmael. I will just share my screen. So can you guys see that? Yeah, perfect. So yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for listening up until now, and thanks for all the great presentations. My name is Kiara. I am a MSc Security Studies student and the research lead for international conflict. And presenting with me today is James. He's a researcher on the international conflict team and also a BA German and history student. I'll just quickly give you an outline of how this presentation will go. I'll start by introducing the research topic and its importance, as well as the research question. James will then contextualize a little bit more by going through the literature. I'll then go through the hypothesis and methodology. James will then introduce the case studies and results, and I will conclude. So, international conflict threatens to undermine the global order of peace we've enjoyed since World War II, and the great power competition is a particular threat to this. When competition intensifies between powerful countries, things like proxy wars can break out, global cooperation can break down, international agreements can also break down. And if we look at the trends, 500 years ago, great powers were almost always fighting each other. But as you can see, the frequency of wars has actually been declining, whereas the deadliness of wars has actually been going in the opposite direction. So the trend is actually increasing. So although great powers go to war with each other less often, wars that do happen seem to be much more damaging. After the Second World War, for the first time in modern human history, we had great power conflicts that were much fewer in number, shorter in duration, and much less much less deadly. People like Steven Pinker, for example, expect this peace trend to continue, but others aren't as optimistic. Nassim Taleb, for example, points out that the long peace only covers a period of about 70 years. So what could be a decline in violent conflict might actually just be a gap between two major wars. So if a war were to occur, we should expect a conflict between two great powers to be quite harmful. At the same time, we sort of have a changing nature of conflict. So recent developments in AI technology suggest that it will have a potentially transformative effect on military power and global politics. China in particular is among one of the forerunners in the development of AI. It's made sufficient plans to make China an AI superpower by 2030. The president believes that being at the forefront in AI technology is critical to the future of global military and economic power competition. And China has backed these plans with significant state funding and has expanded its military budget significantly. And broadly speaking, Sino-American relations are very complex. But yeah, overall, each side has adopted a sort of wary attitude regarding the other as a potential adversary. And in the realm of AI, both states are very cognizant of the advantages linked to being the first to develop AI capabilities. The US in particular wants to ensure comparative advantage in AI development. So this sort of shifting geopolitical landscape and disruptive technological development has significant implications for how a conflict between the US and China might unfold in the future. Which brings us to our research question: to what extent will AI advancements in China affect the risk of a militarized interstate dispute between the US and China? We focus on MIDs, militarized interstate disputes specifically, because we're really seeking to understand, how the US and China are developing AI, how this affects their implementation of the technology, and whether this has the potential to spark a conflict between the two states. But the relevant point here is conflict that falls short of war. Because another trend is that actually, while the number of full-blown wars has been decreasing, the number of militarized interstate disputes has actually been increasing. So in this context, it's reasonable to assume that a conflict between the US and China might rather fall into the MID camp rather than the full-blown war camp. So yeah. I'll hand it over to James to contextualize a little bit more.
Thanks, Chiara, for that introduction. Yeah, as been said, I'm James. I'm one of the researchers for this team, and I'm going to be going into more detail about our survey of the literature and how that feeds then into our hypothesis and our methodology. So, as has been mentioned already, this research question throws up a myriad of sub-research questions, but one of the key words I think in this question is advancement, and specifically, as you will see as this presentation develops, there are what you might call two parallel strands in our analysis. Firstly, there is the development of AI and then the usage of AI. And we feel that in order to fully answer our research question, we needed to survey the literature on both of these two strands, as it were, in order to come to a more balanced conclusion about how the advancement of AI in China might affect the risk of an MID with the US. And the reason that is valid, we feel, is kind of backed up by this quote from Volpe from 2009 that says whether AI intensifies the security dilemma between the US and China will very much depend on the way in which it develops. And our central contention, or rather the first thing that we want to say, is that technology is not a linear development. The availability of technological innovation does not necessarily guarantee its adoption. And indeed, the theoretical framework we use, talking about hard and soft innovation capabilities, which, as you can see here, was developed by Rasker and Binziger in 2015, shows that there are certain constraining and enabling factors. In the hard side, we have things like physical infrastructure and the labor force, and on the soft side, it's cultural factors, political factors, and ideological factors that might either enable or constrain a country when developing emerging technologies, and in this case, AI. And I think what it boils down to here is a state's capacity to act. So if we can move to the next slide. When it comes to a state's capacity to act, there can be certain constraining factors such as public opinion or control of the economy. But in China's case, actually, the political structure, the ideology, and indeed some of the changing geopolitical circumstances can act as enabling factors for the development of AI. And the first thing to note in this example is the focus on these soft factors, on the ideology of the country, on the geopolitics. And that comes back to the political debates, the contemporary political debate, which views China as a threat. And perhaps one of the issues with current scholarship on the subject is this tendency to view China through a Western lens and to view China as a threat. There is, of course, analysis of its hard innovation capabilities, but what it comes down to when determining the threat will be how China chooses to use AI. And we feel certainly that this framing of China as a threat has certain implications and certainly colors certain analyses. But to begin with, when we look at ideology, certainly the key principle, and this is why I put this picture here, of People's War, which was developed by Mao, which has two parts: civil-military fusion, which is fairly self-explanatory and describes the fusion of the public and private sectors, or rather the harnessing of the private sector by the state to develop technology and indeed use it for military purposes. And secondly, The second factor is the so-called active defense principle, which is essentially a preference for short, high-intensity, localized wars using the newest technology to immediately overpower your adversary. And that's very clearly where you can see AI fitting in as that new technology to facilitate short, high-intensity wars that would immediately overpower an adversary. And the role of geopolitics in influencing AI development, as we've already seen, ideology has essentially spurred it on. Geopolitics has shaped it in quite a large way. On the one hand, China's weaker relative to the US, I should say, economic stance in the 1990s could be seen as a constraining factor. But the reason I put Francis Fukuyama's picture up here is because the assumption of American superiority, and yeah, I'm sure everyone remembers his famous dictum about the end of history, actually in some ways allowed China to economically develop, to integrate into the Western system, and as some scholars such as Oslin have argued, weaponize that position. So geopolitics in this case has acted both as a constraining factor and as an enabling factor. But I come back to, and this is why this is the third photo of China as a threat, the main issue when it comes to determining the factors inhibiting or enabling development of AI in China is this tendency to view Chinese AI development through a Western lens, and indeed to carry over the political debate of a Chinese threat into the scholarly realm. And as I've said before, that's reflected in the tendency to focus on soft innovation capabilities rather than hard capabilities. And that's also reflected when we go to the next slide and look at the factors affecting AI adoption in America. Perfect. Yeah. Obviously, scholars are equally concerned about enduring American superiority, or it shouldn't be so general. There is a major worry about the future of US military hegemony, and this has a huge impact, we feel, on the development of AI. Certainly, most of the American population, 58%, believe that this military is the best in the world. So that already tells you quite a lot, or rather how influential the role of the military can be. But as I've said, this anxiety about the future of the US military has influenced public opinion. And indeed, on the other side is also a constraining factor because of the role of ethics. So one factor that's not present in China, but certainly is in America, is negative public opinion about AI, about the lack of responsibility that is associated to AI, especially certain autonomous weapons and in what circumstances they might be used. Has been a huge constraining factor because it has forced politicians to think again and slow down the process of implementation. Whereas in China, this isn't really an issue, or rather not as much of an issue. You might have heard, and indeed this is the picture here, the campaign to stop killer robots, which kind of puts it into perspective for you. And that even influences the private sector. So market forces, again, something that's not really as relevant in China, but certainly in America, the need for companies such as Facebook and Google to distance themselves from the military, and indeed to shield their research and development that could enable AI development for military purposes from the military, because they feel for ethical reasons or indeed for commercial reasons, it's not viable to support the military. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, although some of the case studies go into individual American capabilities, certainly new guided missiles, new autonomous weapons, new drones, these individual capabilities aren't integrated into a modern structure. I mean, it is, for example, quite astounding that until 2019, the American nuclear weapon systems were essentially controlled by floppy disks. I mean, yeah, that was quite surprising to learn in the course of our analysis. So what we have here is perhaps the other side of the coin. So where there is scholarly anxiety about China as a threat, there is also scholarly anxiety about responding to that threat. And indeed, that leads to worries about the future of the US military, and indeed influences public opinion. And the other element of public opinion is the role of ethics and trust. And lastly, there are concerns about the modernity of American military infrastructure. So that's the usage strand, that's the development strand, as it were. And the last part of the literature review, just quickly, is on the usage side. Now, this is important because this is essentially the theoretical background for the case studies, especially, as I put here, the hybrid warfare case study, but also the assassination of Kassem Soleimani. And it's important to note just quickly, because I realize we're short on time, that when surveying the literature, there are a few key themes that come up. One of the first one is how AI can exacerbate information asymmetries. And this leads to uncertainty, and in many cases leads to an escalatory dynamic that increases the risk of an MID. The other thing is that technologies such as emerging technologies such as AI also create so-called first mover advantages. So essentially they incentivize offensive strategies and indeed preemptive strikes, which again influences the risk of MIDs. And this is something that I will go into when we discuss the case studies. But just to round off, the one thing to remember is that when it comes to the factors affecting the development of AI, the main thing to remember is the state's capacity to act, which is enabled in China by its political system and ideology, and perhaps constrained in America, again, by its political system, culture, but also hard factors like infrastructure.
Great. So in the paper, we basically posit that AI advancements in China increase the risk of an MID between China and the US. So here's just sort of a little causal mechanism diagram that we've taken from our paper. Just going through it quickly, China's geopolitical aims, its visions for the PLA, and its goal to be the center of AI world innovation have basically led to China pursuing AI developments at a very rapid pace, especially in comparison to the US. Then not only does Chinese military doctrine allow for more autonomy than in the US, but civil military fusion also allows China to leverage civilian resources for military ends. This pursuit of AI in China might fuel the perception in Washington that Beijing is intent on exploiting this technology to fulfill broader goals, while on the other hand, US pursuit of AI might fuel the perception in Beijing that the US is pushing hard to maintain its relative power vis-a-vis other countries. So on one hand, the US may be prompted to develop AI capabilities at a similar pace than China in order to maintain its position of power, and China may respond in kind, or vice versa. And this sort of perceived potential threat posed by China to the US or the US to China can further escalate into a security dilemma and sort of make arms race dynamics much more likely, which in turn increase the risk of an MID. And then because military AI capabilities are based on externally unverifiable software, and the effects of emerging technology capabilities remain very uncertain, this creates additional uncertainty about one another's capabilities and intentions. So this sort of adds to the overall feeling of mutual mistrust, suspicion, and limited information about the intentions of one another. So any possible signal or demonstration on the part of one side or the other might be misinterpreted as a signal for an MID. So that might then in turn spark an equal response on the opposing side and, again, increase the risk of an MID. So it's incredibly difficult to examine the direct impact of AI on MID risk, just because autonomous weapons capabilities do already exist, but states have yet to develop fully AI-powered weapon systems. So there's a lack of quantitative data as well as qualitative data. So our paper takes more of an exploratory approach. I say exploratory because we basically analyze 5 case studies across a variation of time periods, regions in the world, and types of conflict. And each case provides insight into the various circumstances under which an MID facilitated by advanced or emerging weaponry might arise, as well as the application of such technology in this conflict. The value of this approach is that we can begin to explore the possible range of cases and contexts that can be, further researched with more research. And we can also illustrate the heterogeneity of cases that can be regulated on a policy level. The downside is that we can't extrapolate any causal claims. We can only explore the potential effect of emerging technology in these cases. But we still believe that these cases provide informational value, as I say, to act as a launch pad for further study on AI and international conflict.
Brilliant. Yeah, and that launchpad point is especially important, and I'm sure something that will become clearer as we, or rather as I discuss the case studies. So the first case study we have is the Cold War and the nuclear standoff between the US and the USSR. And there were two MIDs, which ironically, or rather by some rather crass coincidence, occurred on the same evening of October the 27th, 1962. The first one was a U-2 spy plane that accidentally crossed into Soviet airspace. And because this was such secret and new technology, and the Soviets were unaware of the capabilities or the potential nuclear capabilities they believed of the spy plane, they scrambled fighter jets to intercept it. As a result of that, or rather in reaction to that, then American fighters in the vicinity who were armed with nuclear weapons were then sent to protect the aircraft. At the same time that this was going on, a Russian submarine was spotted in the Atlantic Ocean by a US Navy destroyer, who then proceeded to drop depth charges to bring it to the surface. The captain of the submarine, believing that this was an act of war or that the two sides were already at war, then decided to order his men to start arming the nuclear torpedo that the submarine was armed with. It was only very much by chance that a chief of staff who was on board for a reconnaissance mission prevented that from happening. And this is an example of how new technology creates uncertainty, and within a context of incredibly heightened tensions during the Cold War, could lead to MIDs or further. Of course, it's not directly comparable because the threat of mutually assured destruction isn't necessarily the same, and China and America are not so at loggerheads as Russia and America were in 1962. But nonetheless, I would come back to this point about uncertainty and about the impact of emerging technology on the risk of an MID. And of course, the fact that this new technology wasn't the cause of these disputes, it was rather an enabler of them. And that's something, again, that we see, albeit in a more modern form, in the next case study, which is of hybrid warfare. Yeah, and hybrid warfare, for those of you who don't know, has been defined rather by Dr. Frank Hoffman as a combination of conventional military capabilities and irregular tactics. It is ambiguous in that it seeks to obscure the identity of the hybrid actor and blur the distinctions between peace and war. So it sits just below the threshold of conflict, but can be a catalyst for militarized interstate dispute. This form of warfare is most commonly associated with Russia. That's why I've put the example here of Crimea, one of the first examples of its usage. And it essentially involves the manipulation of a political system via technology. But I'm sure most of you are most familiar with its use during the 2016 US election, what was colloquially referred to as the birth of fake news, and the huge disinformation campaign, which is predicted to have caused at least 77 million engagements just on Facebook, which is a quite staggering number. And that was a concerted campaign by bots, which are essentially automated accounts, and trolls, which are fake accounts, but controlled by humans, spreading fake news, as it's called. to sow distrust, to promote Donald Trump and his agenda, to drown out negative stories about Donald Trump, and essentially force a decline in the polls of Hillary Clinton. As I'm sure most of you remember, the Democratic National Committee emails were leaked, and that was especially damaging for Clinton, and one of the reasons perhaps why she lost that election. So the ability of artificial intelligence to not only sow distrust, but then also to destabilize the political system could be a major catalyst for a militarized interstate dispute. And the reason this is important for us is that Russia is not the only country using this method. China is also very much interested in hybrid warfare. And the added factor here is that hybrid warfare very much fits into the Chinese strategy of three warfares that uses media, legal, and psychological methods to manipulate and subdue an enemy. So we know already that it complements existing Chinese strategy, and indeed that China was one of the main actors seeking to influence the 2020 election. So this is something, or rather this is a trend that we feel will continue, and is certainly a catalyst, because in an age where it's so uncertain how to respond to an attack that not only is very difficult to attribute, but also sits below the threshold of conflict. Either the US might respond in kind or mistakenly respond to someone who didn't actually launch the attack. The opportunities for an MID to occur certainly massively increase when hybrid warfare is used. And when we turn to the third example, now we're coming more towards China specifically in this case. So the Gulf War was a short conflict, and here we're referring to the first Gulf War in 1991. It was a short conflict, essentially sparked by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and then America became involved through Operation Desert Storm to push Saddam Hussein out. And because it was such a clear example of the benefits of using advanced technology in warfare, and indeed because it was mostly the bombing campaign that led to Iraq's loss, it led to a flurry of academic papers on the centrality, for example, of UAVs, of GPS systems, reconnaissance satellites, and C4ISR, which I'm going to have to look at here, is command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So essentially, this conflict was the first example of concerted usage of these new technologies of essentially electronic warfare that then caused countries such as China, China ironically being the country who had supplied the Iraqis, so it was rather an embarrassment for them to review what had worked for the Americans and not worked for the Iraqis through at least 7 high-level meetings between January and May 1991. And this is, I suppose, the context within which we view the beginning of Chinese development of AI for military purposes. Again, as is a running theme throughout these case studies, it's also about the uncertainty. So in the wake of the Gulf War, America was incredibly uncertain about the extent to which China had taken up these technologies. And again, that led to an escalatory dynamic, which in some ways feeds into our next case study of the Kosovo War. So the Kosovo War happened 8 years afterwards. And again, in this case, I know there were several. This refers to the bombing campaign between March and June 1999 by NATO of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, because NATO and especially Western countries were concerned about the Serbian ethnic cleansing of Muslims in Kosovo. Now, the first opportunity for analysis is the Chinese intervention in this conflict, the diplomatic intervention, and that's not a novel discovery, but certainly because it relates so clearly to, for example, contemporary debates about Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, and Hong Kong is incredibly important, because in 1999, the Chinese felt that the Kosovo War could set a precedent for international intervention. And you also have to remember the preceding example of the Gulf War and the context of heightened diplomatic tensions in the wake of incidents like Tiananmen Square. So there was certainly huge Chinese anxiety about the way that America might operate and about the precedent this might set. And indeed, this was the context of uncertainty that led to this MID, which is contained in the picture here, which was the supposedly, or allegedly, I should say, accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade by the Americans on May 7th, 1999. Initially, it was put down to an accident, but it does seem an incredible coincidence that America's newest weapons, B-2 bomber and JDAM, joint direct attack munition, GPS guided weapons, that's a mouthful, which were the weapon of choice for the most sensitive of targets, missed their supposedly intended target by 440 meters. The greater coincidence still was that they accurately destroyed what was viewed then as the major intelligence collection platform for the Chinese without destroying the rest of the embassy. So whilst I can't say that this is a direct attack or show of force by the Americans on the Chinese, the circumstantial evidence heavily suggests that intention could be the case here. Rather, it's more likely that it was intentional than wasn't. But if we take that hypothetical scenario and we believe that it was intentional, hypothetically, it's very interesting to consider this surrounding context that I've kind of put before you, the example of the example of the Gulf War, Tiananmen Square, and Chinese anxieties about Xinjiang and other provinces in China, because what we have here is essentially an example of how geopolitical factors then override the role of emerging technologies. So in this case, it wasn't that America had an emerging technology and then attacked. It was there is a pre-existing conflict, and America, taking advantage of its geopolitical dominance and the fact that it had superior technology, knew that the likelihood of retaliation would be less, and thus the attack became more desirable. So we see here the potential dynamics for a future MID, especially given the fact that this context is quite similar to heated debates in the South China Sea and the other areas I've already mentioned. But the value of this case study is also, again, as with the Gulf War, looking at how China reacted to this war. And in this case, the war lasted more than twice as long. It lasted 78 days. America, obviously, the superior force won out. But it was very interesting that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia avoided the large-scale casualties that the Iraqis had. And indeed, it was the genesis of what Vontra calls asymmetrical countermeasures. So I have here a rather crude picture of one of the things that actually did happen during this war, which was the use, for example, of electric heaters or bonfires to confuse heat-seeking missiles. Now, obviously, this isn't directly comparable to the present. Heat-seeking missiles have got a lot more accurate and a lot better at avoiding false heat signatures. But this is the context within which AI development was created, because the Chinese realized that they couldn't reach parity, as the USSR had attempted to do and indeed gone bankrupt for it. Instead, what they do is target American weaknesses and then develop superiority in AI to achieve superiority in a select field. And lastly, just very quickly, which I suppose is the most current example here, we have the assassination of Kassem Soleimani. And the argument here, I suppose, revolves around the idea of whether it was the Reaper drone that caused the assassination or the pre-existing conflict. And although it's impossible to say which is which, it's more likely that here, again, as we've seen before, the technology acts as an enabler, as a catalyst rather than as a cause. Certainly the conflict had been ongoing, but it's definitely true to say that there would have been less targeted killings had this technology not existed. So that's just final validation of our point that AI here acts as an enabler of conflict rather than as a cause. And those are the main points that we brought out from our case studies.
Thanks, James. Really in depth. Yeah, so just a few very, very quick concluding remarks. We've argued that the development of AI increases the risk of an MID between China and the US. Our case studies provide an illustration of the circumstances under which an MID facilitated by emerging or advanced weaponry might arise and why. Our paper has adopted quite a realist approach. We think that realism provides value in unpacking how conflict can be driven by the need to maintain competitiveness and international dominance. And in light of the rapid developments in AI and US and China perceptions of each other's intentions and how they calculate their offensive strategies vis-a-vis one another, this framework seemed appropriate in light of our question. We briefly considered potential ideological basis for increased China-US competition over AI superiority. So future research might wish to look into the country-specific effects of AI advancements on China or the US. And in this case, other frameworks might be interesting or useful, for example, constructivism. Thank you very much.